Thank you, Katie, and hello, everybody. It's really nice to see you all today. I am going to talk about careers in English language and linguistics. So if you do this degree, what can you do with it? And I often get people asking me this, particularly parents asking me this at open days and visit days, because English language is something that we use generally every day. It's something that we use for reading and writing and so on. And people don't really understand what kind of skills you develop by studying a degree in our area, and the fact that these skills are highly transferable, and they are the kinds of skills that employers want, and they also lead to training in a number of different sorts of areas. So let's have a look at some of the things that students learn when they study English language and linguistics. So linguistics is basically the scientific study of speech and language. And we're interested in things like how languages work, so the nutsy boltsy stuff, the phonology, which is to do with spoken language, the grammar, the semantics, that's meaning, discourse analysis, so looking at how people speak or write different sorts of texts. We're also interested in how the brain affects language, how we use language, and how language affects how we think, because there's a link between language and culture, and we find that the way that we experience the world can influence the way that we use language. Also, how people learn languages, whether we're looking at learning your language from your mum or your dad or your caregivers, whether we're looking at that sort of language learning, or if we're looking at people learning languages later on in life. For example, I did French and German at school, and later on I learnt Dutch and Japanese. And so we're interested in how people learn those sorts of languages. And also, as we'll see later, English is a big language used all around the world as an international lingua franca. So we'll have a look at some people who work in that kind of area. Also, how people use language in different situations. So we find that people don't use language the same way if they are speaking to somebody they're in a relationship with, a personal relationship, in comparison to speaking to a work colleague. Online, we find that speech is quite different as well. And in the media, if you think about having an argument with somebody, for example, and then you think about what a scripted argument looks like, then those things are likely to be very different. We're also interested in how language can be used to persuade, to deceive, to persecute, and to empower. So how we can use language to change people's minds or behavior, that sort of thing. And we're also interested in how ideas and policies about language can affect things like social inclusion, equality, and social justice, and so on. So you develop a number of different sorts of skills through studying these kinds of areas. You learn how to express yourself effectively in writing and using writing in combination with images and video and so on. You also learn how to analyze things that other people say and how they say them, and evaluate different sorts of communication. So if something was effective, what went right? If it wasn't effective, what was the problem? Why did it go wrong? Why did a person not get their message over effectively? Also, how to communicate effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds. That's something that's very important in our area. We look at intercultural communication and how languages differ in the way that they communicate similar kinds of meanings. Also, how to think critically and engage in effective decision making, how to work in teams with others. So you'll be doing some group work exercises where you'll be working in teams, and may do work placements where you also will need to work in teams. How to analyze large data sets and do statistics. So you might collect speech data, that's the kind of research that I do, or you might collect written language, or you might collect language that's written, but it's kind of speechy, like text form, for example, that sort of thing. So how to get lots of this data and how to analyze it and how to do statistical analysis on it. So we are actually quite a numerate subject, and a lot of people, when they think English language, they don't automatically think that you'll need to learn about statistics. And also how to apply your knowledge of language and communication to real world problems. We're not interested in just theorizing about stuff. We're interested in getting you to think about what real world problems there are and how we can use language to help us address those problems so that it makes the situation better for everybody that's involved in a particular situation. Now, this is not a very good resolution screen, but what you can see here is very important skills for recent college graduates that we're hiring. And we've got their business executives in dark blue or in the darker color, and then hiring managers in the light blue, in the lighter color. And you can see that all of the sorts of things that are listed down the side there, so ability to effectively communicate orally, critical thinking and analytical reasoning, ethical judgment and decision making, able to work effectively in teams, able to prioritize, hang on, I've lost myself, able to work independently, prioritize and manage time. So prioritize was in there. Self-motivated, initiative, proactive, ideas and solutions, able to communicate effectively in writing, and can apply knowledge and skills to real world settings. So all the sorts of things that I was talking about before, you can see that these are things which are considered to be very, very important for recent college graduates. So if you do a degree in our area, then you will be equipping yourselves with these really, really vital and important skills. So some of the research that we do in our area that feeds into real world situations includes research by my colleague Fraibet Aveledo, who has been looking at the benefits of being a bilingual speaker, so bilingualism, multilingualism, speaking more than one language. And she was looking at patients with multiple sclerosis in this particular study. And found that multiple sclerosis patients who were bilinguals scored better than their single language speaking peers in cognitive tests. So this sort of thing demonstrates that being bilingual, being able to use more than one language is actually something that very much benefits your cognitive abilities, and it can help to support you if you have a neurodegenerative disease such as multiple sclerosis. And also she's been looking at things like Alzheimer's as well. And we know that bilingualism has a number of very, very strong benefits as far as cognitive development is concerned and the ability to do better in cognitive tests. My colleague Sylvia Jaworska works in a number of different sorts of areas, but she's interested in business context and industry and so on. And this particular image is illustrating the fact that she's done a lot of work looking at women in the workplace and how language can be used to discriminate against them, and being able to raise the awareness that these sorts of things are happening, and looking at how this can be combated effectively. So making sure that managers are aware that they may be discriminating against women in the workplace by the sorts of language that they're using, and working out how to improve the situation for people who are women in the workplace. My colleague Tony Capstick, and we'll come to a little video of him later, works with migrant populations. He started as an English language teacher, as we'll hear, but he started to get very much interested in migrant populations and how things to do with language can help them improve their lives, can help them escape migrant camps, for example, and how teaching English in these sorts of camps is something that can very much benefit migrant populations. I've done a number of different sorts of things. I should change that title. I'm professor, not doctor. Well, I am also doctor, but I'm a professor, so it should say that really. But anyway, that's about me. I've worked on in a number of different areas, including forensic speaker comparison and forensic speaker profiling. And this is illustrating one of the cases I was asked about by the media it was identified that a terrorist named Jihadi John spoke with a British accent, and they were interested in if you could tell anything about him from the way that he spoke. And so I did some research for the media about this and identified that he was speaking using an accent called multicultural London English. So that kind of located him in that area of the world. And also the media was very interested in whether or not he was an immigrant. And so I was looking at whether he was a bilingual, if he was an early bilingual, and so on. I was looking at those sorts of things. One does have to be a little bit careful when corresponding with the press because they tend to twist things around a little bit. We've had some work done on accents, for example, where it's been indicated that multicultural London English is an accent that's being used by a lot of people, and some areas of the press are unhappy with this because it indicates that people are corrupting our beautiful language. Now, as far as we're concerned as linguists, we don't take that view at all. We just be able to say this kind of thing is happening, you can see these features and so on. But there are some areas of the press that will use the research to their advantage in a way that's quite difficult. Another thing that I was involved with, and I didn't actually do this research, but I was asked about it for a television program, was looking at men being unable to make their voices sound sexy. So this was a study done by some other researchers, which showed that if they asked men and women, so we're talking about cisgender men and cisgender women, and they were heterosexual, not gay or lesbian. So what they asked them to do was to count from 1 to 10 in a normal sort of way, whatever that was, and then in a dominant way, a confident way, a sexy way, and an intelligent way. And they found that, according to the listeners, both men and women could improve their dominance, confidence, and intelligence. They scored higher on those things, but the women scored higher on being able to produce a sexy voice, but the men didn't. In fact, they scored worse. So this was an interesting study looking at things like women do have this ability to make their voices, to change their voices to sound sexy. But if a woman is looking for a sexy man, and we're talking again about cisgender people rather than transgender people, then we'd find that it's already their voice that they've got, which could be the sexy thing. And but if they try to make themselves sound sexy, they don't sound sexy at all. So it was just an interesting kind of thing to get into there. So I've done media work, having worked in this kind of area. So what sorts of jobs can you get? Well, there's lots and lots of different ones. People always say, what job can you get with this? There's just so many, and here's a list, but it's really not the end of the list at all. So we've got things like publisher, journalist, web content writer, human resources manager, public relations consultant, computational linguist. I won't read them all off, you can see them there. You might be surprised by some of them. I mean, games developer, for example, we've had some students go into that, and this is because if you study linguistics, then you are able to study systems. You can learn computer languages. You could do that anyway, but being able to understand linguistics supports you in the ability to understand how computer languages work and to develop those sorts of skills. Because communication is so important in this area, we also see that things like human resources, public relations, diversity trainers, and so on are things that our students end up doing. And I did have a student who went and ran Chester Zoo for a bit and then trained to be a paramedic. And she was saying that the work that we did with her when she became a paramedic was really important because she understood how to change the way that she spoke to different demographics when she was working with them in the ambulance to be able to speak to them in a way that they would understand because of the different sorts of communication that we have with different kinds of people from different backgrounds and different age groups and different genders and so on. So there really are all sorts of things where this kind of job is relevant. And it's just worth noting that everything we do is mediated through language, whether we're looking at written language, spoken language, sign language, whether we're looking at a series of images, it's a kind of language. So we are communicating, doing things, and they are mediated through language. So it really is the sort of area that permeates everything. So here are some examples: English language teacher, speech and language therapist, forensic linguist, computational linguist, and human resources manager or consultant. So these are all big areas where you might be communicating. And I'm going to play you some short videos in a moment of some of my colleagues talking about their experience. But also, if you go into English language teaching abroad, and we have quite a few students that do that every year, you have opportunities to travel, to learn about different cultures and languages, which is so important in today's world. It's also a very stable and growing job market. English language teachers are always needed around the world, so you can pretty much guarantee that you'll be able to find work in this area. And there are opportunities to make a difference, so helping people in less well-off contexts, for example. I did some work with, when I was at York University, I did some work with some migrants to support their English language teaching, and that was a charity where we worked with them to help them learn English so that they could operate well in the context that they've moved into. And we also did some work on different accents, because the accent that they use in Yorkshire is quite different from the accent that I'm using now. So we talked to them about understanding different sorts of accents and so on. So it was really interesting. Okay, so I am going to play you a video of my colleague, Professor Claire Furneaux, who is going to tell you something about her experience with English language teaching, which is something that she did before coming into academia. So take it away, Claire.
English language teaching abroad is a fantastic career. Some people will go abroad, work as English language teachers, fall in love with it, and spend the rest of their lives doing it. Some people will just go for a couple of years maybe after they graduate in order to experience another country, learn a language, develop skills that they can then bring back or stay in that country in another career area if they want. And they might move on from having been a teacher in a language school to perhaps becoming a director of studies, a manager, a tester. They might move into language testing, materials development. They might move out of language schools and into state schools or into universities. So there you are, living in their country. You are their guest, you are their teacher, and they spoil you. They take you out, they look after you, they make sure that you love their country as much as they do, and you end up loving it as much as they do because you see it through their eyes. So you're not a tourist, you're living there, and you're part of the community. To do a degree in English language and applied linguistics, because that is what I needed when I moved into the main area of English language teaching in all the countries I worked in after that. That understanding of phonology, phonetics, of grammar, of sociolinguistics, how language hangs together, how we use language in different situations, social media, all of that. There is this sort of fundamental understanding of language that is inculcated in our students throughout the whole program. They might move on, but they might then come back to Britain or go to America, Australia, somewhere else, and do a master's in applied linguistics is one of the options, and there are lots of programs also in teaching English to speakers of other languages, and many of them will go on to do that. And as I said, some may further down the road decide they want an academic career, and they may then come back and do a PhD with us. But for many people, the MA will be a jumping off point for major positions of responsibility within universities, within language schools, and within major testing organisations. There will always be work for well-qualified, enthusiastic English language teachers, and a BA in language and linguistics is a really good entry level into that world.
Okay, so that's my colleague, Professor Claire Furneaux. I'm also going to show you, no, we don't need to see her again. I'm going to show you a clip of my colleague Tony Capstick, who works with developing with migrants and in development contexts, because he also started in English language teaching, but as you'll hear, his career took him into working with migrant populations.
I started out as a language teacher in Greece and Italy, but then I moved to, well, I was very interested in developing country contexts. I was interested in going to parts of the world where those classrooms aren't full of resources, so they've not had access to the fantastic resources that we have to study English and study English language teaching in the UK, for example. And so I went off to Cambodia first for 2.5 years, where I worked in rural Cambodia with teacher trainers. So Cambodians in a teacher training college, trying to build their skills, build their teacher training programs and develop those. And I worked alongside them in a capacity building type of environment. So that was after a few years of having taught English in Europe. And so what an English language degree program can do is introduce you to many of those issues. So, for example, at the University of Reading, we have modules on English language teaching in second year and in third year. But we also have modules called Language and Migration, which look at classrooms and they look at how we can respond to all of this movement that's going on in the world now, tens of thousands of displaced people on the move. How do we respond to their language learning needs? And how do we train teachers to be able to respond to those needs in the classroom? As people move around, they take their languages with them, but that means that we need to respond to that variation in a way that, as I say, helps them to fit into their new surroundings, maintain their home languages, which is also quite difficult, helping people who have moved country, helping them find opportunities to either develop literacy in their first language or continue using a language that their parents and grandparents use, whilst also providing opportunities for them to develop perhaps the new national language of the country that they're living in. English has this new role around the world that isn't just about benefiting elite groups, but it can often be about helping poorer communities with fewer resources gain access to education or research or jobs.
Okay, so that's my colleague Tony. Going on to speech and language therapy. In speech and language therapy, we're basically interested in helping people overcome conditions that mean they're unable to communicate effectively using spoken or written language. And we find that speech and language therapists, as well as working for the National Health and in hospitals and in clinics and so on, are also in high demand in schools and care homes and so on, in places where there might be people who are having difficulty articulating speech or using language. This is quite well-paid, rewarding work, and if you do an undergraduate degree, a BA in our area, then it certainly qualifies you for a place on a postgraduate course. You do need to do additional training. If you do want to do this, then it's usual to have experience as well, although you can also just do a degree in speech and language therapy, and in that case you don't need to have experience. But what we normally find is that a proportion of our students will do English language and linguistics, and then they'll decide that they would like to be a speech therapist, and so they will train to do that. So there's a little video here of me with a different haircut but in the same room talking about this, and I think this is the video where Rodney forgot to put my title on, my name on. Anyway, we'll see. Here we go. So this is me talking about speech and language therapy.
My name's Jen Setter. I'm Professor of Phonetics, and that means that I work on speech science, which is to do with the way people produce speech, the way people perceive speech, and how speech sounds and other things like intonation and so on pattern in languages to create meaning. So what kinds of careers can you do with an interest in speech and language like I have?
I think one of the obvious ones is speech and language therapy. So having a really good knowledge and understanding of how speech sounds are articulated by typically developing people is really important in enabling a speech and language therapist to work out what's happening if somebody is unable to articulate things in a particular way, which means that their speech might not be clear to somebody who is listening to it. So speech therapists typically work on strategies with people who have either a developmental problem, so this will be children who might be born with something like cleft palate, for example. Also, there are people who might suffer from a stroke, for example, later in life. So this is called an acquired syndrome or an acquired issue. And if you have some kind of damage to your brain that could be through a stroke or even through a head injury, another kind of head injury, then it's possible that the areas that are associated with the production or the perception of language are affected, and the speech therapist will have to work with the client to help them, again, from a phonetic point of view, articulate sounds and perceive sounds, but also from a linguistic point of view as well. So we're looking at language as well, not just speech. Okay, so that was me going on about speech and language therapy. Okay. Another area that I've worked in, as I mentioned before, was forensic speaker identification. Forensic linguistics is a little bit different from forensic speech science. So with speakers, I'm interested in if we've got some evidence where somebody has spoken the evidence, so they've left a threatening phone call, for example, something like that, and then the police interview people, then we would look to see how likely it is that the threatening phone call is spoken by the person that the police are interviewing by doing acoustic and auditory analysis of the speech. But we also get forensic linguistics, which is looking at written texts much more. And again, that's to determine whether or not a particular piece of writing was likely to have been produced by a specific person. So we're using linguistics to solve crimes, basically, and we're interested in also in something like determination of place of origin, although this is a highly contentious area. So when people come to somewhere like the UK, for example, and seek asylum, then very often people are used to analyze the speech and see if the person is actually coming from the place they claim they're coming from. This is a very contentious area, but it does happen in some countries. And then interpreting meaning and speaker intentions. And these people will either work for a private firm, or they'll work for law enforcement agencies, the government, or you might work for the armed forces or something like that. So looking at whether or not a specific piece of language or speech is likely to be produced by a given person, or if you can profile that speaker, what you can say about them based on the way that they're speaking. So that's quite an interesting area. Also, we find people go into computational linguistics, so this includes natural language processing, searches, machine translation. Computational linguists can actually earn quite a lot of money, so an average salary of £54,000. If you are starting, I don't know where this figure comes from, this was suggested by a colleague, but it's actually quite well paid work. And we find that people might go and work for companies that use speaker recognition, or that do machine translation, or as is mentioned here, or that do speech synthesis. So here's some examples of tech companies that were interested in hiring. It says 3 months ago, but it's actually from November 2021. And you can see that companies such as Google, which uses Alexa, sorry, Google doesn't use Alexa, does it? No, Amazon uses Alexa. What does Google use? I think maybe you can hook into Google with Alexa as well. There's Siri that's used with Apple, and then there are other sorts of companies where you can speak to things, for example, and they will speak back to you, synthesize language. We're also interested interested in things like machine learning, because if people are going to, if machines are going to learn linguistic rules, then you need linguists to say what the rules are. So we find that qualified linguists are very much wanted by tech companies because of the need to interact with language and speech and different sorts of language processes. Also supporting language for the blind, for example. So being able to have a reader where you can put the reader over something and it will read out the text to somebody who is blind, for example, and so on, and subtitling for the blind. So there's for the hard of hearing, subtitling for the blind, that makes no sense. Subtitling for the hard of hearing. So we find that linguists are wanted in all sorts of areas that are involved with technology. Other jobs, so UX design, content strategists, data scientists, technical writers, social media marketers, because we're all about communication. So if you are putting up a social media site like a Facebook or an Instagram or something like that, then if you're going to have language involved, then you will need somebody who is able to understand effective communication for different sorts of groups to enable you to target those groups specifically with that kind of language. So there's lots of different sorts of things there that are relevant to linguists. Also jobs in business. So we're looking at things like management, marketing, human resources, and customer service and public relations. So management is quite obvious. It's about managing people, managing teams. Marketing is to do with communicating your strategies and so on, or communicating what it is that you've got to sell. Human resources is to do with managing the personnel in a company. This can also involve legal stuff. And customer service and public relations is, of course, all about dealing with your customers and being able to communicate effectively with them. So my colleague Sylwia Jaworska is going to talk a bit about linguistics in human resources management, and then we've actually got her speaking on another one of these topics as well. So this is Sylwia.
Over the last few years, I've been working with large organizations and large institutions, including accounting companies, IT companies, and food manufacturers. And these companies are coming to us linguists, actually now these days quite frequently, because they've recognized that most of the work they do is actually through language, and they require linguistic expertise to help them with a variety of tasks. Companies realized that they need to be more diverse and inclusive nowadays. Not just because they want to, but because diversity and inclusion is actually really beneficial when it comes to producing new outputs, for example, when it comes to bringing new products onto the market. So this is why companies are nowadays very much interested in making sure that they come across as inclusive and diverse, and they treat their employees also equally and fairly. Linguists are now being employed to help organizations to develop, for example, something like structures for performance reviews, descriptions of candidates, even things like writing job descriptions. It's really important because we want to make sure that we address a wide diversity of people, or not a particular profile, essentially. So we as linguists, we are trying to help organizations to ensure that the language that they use is, for example, not favoring a particular group of people, for example, only white males. Revealing these particular instances and by helping the organization to recognize that perhaps certain word choices may be actually perpetuating gender biases, I was able to help the organization to develop performance descriptors, performance descriptions that were actually much more fair and much more equal, and not promoting a particular type of an employee. So based on my own research, in which I looked in the ways how men and women are described, I found out that there are actually quite profound differences. It's not just the differences. What is important here is the outcomes of these differences, because while men were promoted, women were not. And obviously, while there's a whole set of factors that influence the promotion, it turns out that language is one of them. So by raising awareness of the role of language when it comes to promotion, perhaps, when it comes to performance appraisals and so on.
Oh, she's disappeared. Anyway, it's important, obviously, that managers are aware of these sorts of issues. Okay, Sylvia's going to talk about other opportunities in business as well. So she's just going to explain what else you can do with a degree in this area.
To give you another example, we've been also involved in work with a number of food manufacturers. When you go to the supermarket, you are confronted with a lot of information on food packaging. So as part of the large project we were working on, we were helping organizations, food manufacturers, to design labels and to put information in the way that is actually understood by consumers, that it helps consumers to make healthy food choices and also choices that are perhaps more sustainable. When it comes to communicating information to consumers, organizations, whether food industry or other, for example, IT companies, rely more and more on linguistic expertise to produce information that people basically can trust, or information that help people make choices, better choices. And that's precisely the space where linguists are actually quite sought after, because they know the language and they know how to write in a way that other people can understand it, but also in a way that are creative, because creativity is also very important. And linguists, of course, find quite a lot of opportunities in the IT industry, where our linguistic understanding of how language works is actually critical to developing things such as artificial intelligence. Linguists are really becoming sought after employees because of the variety of skills that we bring to professions and organizations. While organizations may require certain technical expertise, they also, more importantly, need to actually work with clients, with consumers, and they need to work with other partners. And that's precisely the kind of skills that we bring to the organizations. Students or graduates with a degree in English language and linguistics bring a whole set of different skills that makes them also very flexible and very adaptable workers. And I think that's the key nowadays in our modern world, when sometimes just one expertise is often not enough. And that's why linguists often really perform incredibly well in any professional context. Just to give you an example here, currently the CEO of YouTube is actually someone who studied English language and literature.
There you go, CEO of YouTube. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So yeah, there really are a variety of things that you can do with the kinds of skills that you develop. And looking at this figure here, we can see that we've got a calculator and figures and spreadsheets and graphs and all sorts of things. We train our graduates to be able to understand numeracy type data, produce their own numerate data, so quantitative data from research, and be able to understand it, show graphs that demonstrate what's going on, and communicate their ideas and their research very effectively. And these are the sorts of things which are very useful skills in business. Now, I am very proud to say that from our degree in English language and linguistics, 100% of leavers are in work and or further study 15 months after the end of this course. We don't have anybody who is not working or not studying. They're all doing one or the other. So first of all, that just makes me really, really proud of our graduates, but also it's a very, very good news story for anybody who is thinking about studying English language and linguistics or English language, depending on which degree you're looking at. But certainly if you come and study with us, this is our statistic. So we're doing very well in producing graduates that have excellent skills that employers want, or that enable them to go on to further study after they finish their degree programs. So if you have any questions at all, and I can see that we've got a bit of time for questions at the end, Anyway, if you have any questions at all, you can contact me. This is my email address. I am the admissions tutor. You can also find me on Twitter. I am on Instagram, but I hardly ever post on there. But you can certainly find me on Twitter. I usually post once every day or once every other day. And I've got somebody actually asking me a question at the moment about how I would transcribe something in a Beatles song. So I need to go back and have a look at that. But yes, if you are interested in anything I've had to say, or if you're interested in studying with us, drop me a line, or drop the University of Reading a line and it will find me.
Oh, Jane, thank you so much. If I may, can I ask you a couple of questions which have come in during it based on what you've said? So, quick question which was just around placements and the fact that you can do it on your degree, and of course we do offer a degree with a placement year. Just one about if you can study abroad or do your placement abroad, sorry, when you're on the degree programme, or does it have to be based in the UK?
No, that's possible. You can study abroad, you can do a placement abroad, you can do a placement in the UK. We have modules that have placement opportunities built into them. We have an entire module that is basically a whole placement, and you provide a report of something to do with language and communication. So you need to write something about that based on a work placement. So there's lots of opportunities for placements and for study abroad, and we have partners all over the world if you're interested in studying. With placements, we largely expect the students to find the placement themselves, but if you've got a family member, for example, who happens to work in Japan and has a placement opportunity for you, and you want to go and do that for a year, then we would be absolutely up for that.
Lovely, thank you so much. That's really helpful. And I guess this is perhaps linked to it, which is thinking about bringing in multiple languages. You spoke about what you studied previously. Can you study languages alongside doing English language and linguistics at university?
So yes, we have at Reading, we have 4 languages that are offered at degree level: French, German, Italian and Spanish, and you can do a degree in each one of those with English language. I think you come on to a modern foreign languages degree to start with, so modern foreign languages with English language, and then you specialise a bit later on, but absolutely you can do that. And we also have something called the institution-wide language programme, and students are allowed to take modules in languages outside of their degree every year. So you could do the same language all the way through. So if you decided you wanted to learn Mandarin Chinese, for example, then you could develop your Mandarin Chinese language in the first, second and third years, or even maybe do first and second year and then go abroad somewhere that spoke Mandarin and then come back and do a final year. Or alternatively, you can do different languages every year if you want to, and that's also something that we like, because if you learn about different languages and about different language structures, then that can help you understand linguistics and how it works, and also how language interacts with culture, which again is something that's very important, understanding different cultures, different backgrounds, and the kind of thing that Sylvia was talking about to do with diversity and inclusion.
Thank you. And then the very last question which came in, I think is based on Sylvia's work, sort of women in the workplace and the diversity. Is there a chance to pick this up within the degree programme, sort of study modules associated with that?
We have a specific option module called Language and Gender. So that is looking at that area in particular. It's not necessarily looking at the workplace, it's looking at all sorts of areas to do with language and gender. You start with basic core modules, and in the second year further core modules in sociolinguistics, which looks at how language generally works in society, how different societal groups use language differently and so on. And then if you wanted to do something on language and gender, then you could select that as an optional module, and we often have dissertations that are looking at some aspect of language and gender as well. So that's another possibility if you wanted to do that.
Thank you. Yeah, and the dissertations, you can choose your own topic, can't you? So if you've got a particular area you're interested in, that's a really good chance to explore it then. Am I correct there?
Yes, that's right. We will guide you to make sure it's something that you can feasibly do as a dissertation. So we'll help you to narrow it down, because if you try to do too much, then you end up with something that's not very coherent. So we'll work with you. You'll have a supervisor who works with you about what sort of thing you're interested in, how you could collect data in that area, how you could analyze it, what to read to support your understanding in that area. So you'll be guided in it. And yes, we have dissertations in all sorts of different areas every year. Lots of really, really interesting ones. We've had ones looking at Donald Trump's language, for example. I had a student who looked at creaky voice, which is this sort of voice quality. So she was interested in that. So she worked on that with me. We have students who are looking at cognitive impairment with my colleague Fribet Aveledo, language and gender, of course. We seem to have a spate of work on Disney princess language at one point. I think that's gone away, but that was a thing. We had several dissertations working on that. Something I'd be interested in at the moment is the use of specific accents in some television programs. So I don't know if you're aware, but in the Rings of Power, which was the prequel to the Lord of the Rings, the directors chose specific accents for different groups, and there was a lot of controversy over that. So that kind of thing is of interest. But there's all kinds of things that you can do in this area. We're really just interested in you looking at how language interacts, how people use it, and how it can influence the world around us, really.
Oh, thank you. It sounds so interesting, and I'm sure people have more questions that they'll want to ask. So as Jane said, her contact details are on the screen now. Do get in touch. But let's draw today to a close. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found it as useful and as interesting as I have. And if we don't speak to you before, we hope to see you in September if you're thinking about joining us. All right, take care. Thank you, Jane. Goodbye.